sold as postcards, and the image just literally took off. He was a very romantic figure, and he was viewed by the Germans as being a very potent image to try and bolster a war-weary nation. And this went on quite unscrupulously in many ways until the end of his life. He was pursued by the press, by newsreels, and of course at the same time he was carrying on his normal combat career, leading 4 squadrons, as eventually he did. So the whole time he had this going on behind him, this constant drive to seek the greatest publicity from him.
The propaganda campaign was so successful that eventually even the London Times carried news of his victories. The strain of public relations work was kept away from British aces like Albert Ball, who received much less exposure because of War Office policy.
They quite clearly, and it's well documented, didn't wish to have anybody special. They didn't see the value of propaganda. They felt that the lesser-known pilots would feel insulted by having a few chosen and picked out as something special. They preferred the mass to achieve anonymity. There'd be no special case at all. So it was really in the interwar years that the likes of Ball, McCudden, Mannock and Bishop, their names relatively became known in a wider way.
April 1917 was a bleak month for the Royal Flying Corps. Newer, faster German aircraft accounted for 224 British machines, 21 of them credited to Richthofen. The average flying life of an RFC pilot was 17.5 hours. By May, though, new aircraft were arriving from British factories, and the German flying service began to lose its technical advantage. The Allies always had more aircraft than the Germans, so the successes of Richthofen and his flyers could not last. To compensate, a plan was devised to group squadrons together to achieve temporary domination over a particular sector. Since these groups could be moved quickly between stretches of the front line, they became known as flying circuses. Richthofen was given command of the first. For British pilots, the strategy posed new problems.
In my experience in 20 Squadron, never ever came across the German Air Force when we weren't outnumbered. Sometimes we'd go for weeks, up to 3 weeks, without seeing a German aeroplane in the sky. And then we would come across multitudes of them, and always we were outnumbered, always. I've never had a scrap when we weren't outnumbered. One was always frightened, but one was more frightened of what was going to happen to the aeroplane you were flying, because you see, the petrol was pumped by air pressure from the 2 tanks, which the Bristol fighter had, to the carburetor. This, you can imagine, was a very explosive mixture. If any time the Germans hit a petrol tank in a Bristol fighter, it invariably went up in flames. It exploded and went up in flames. And one gets to the stage where, you know, that is the dominating factor in your life, or it was in our lives, of this risk of being blown up in the sky and going down in flames. No parachutes. And I saw so many of my friends, you know, getting out of their aeroplanes onto the side because the flames were engulfing them. And this was way up, 15,000 feet up. They hadn't a hope, of course. The aeroplane would fall to pieces long before they hit the ground.
After many months of combat flying, Richthofen's luck ran out. During a dogfight, he was struck in the head by a stray bullet.
His friends noted a marked change in his character. He became more depressed, more isolated almost from his contemporaries. He would spend more time in his own quarters, reading or writing reports. And generally his whole character did change, and it didn't change again and in the rest of his life, that he stayed this like depressed individual. One sign, visual sign of this effect was after his 60th victory, he then ceased collecting trophies, the cups, for example. Number 60 was the last. And whilst he proffered the excuse that there was a shortage of silver, and in fact there's no silver to build anymore, make any more of these cups, I suspect the real reason was that in fact he just lost interest, that his hunting instincts had really disappeared, and he had took no pleasure in the hunt or killing. And I think this is really the major changing point in his life. From there, it was downhill psychologically.
Richthoven's psychological traumas were the common experience of airmen on both sides of the lines.
When I joined 20 Squadron, they had a system even then of sending people home when they'd done so many operations or so long over the lines. You see, one used to get terrible nightmares and things of that sort, with aeroplanes all in flames whirling round you in the sky, and wake up screaming at night. I used to share a hut with my observer, Hardcastle, and he was affected the same way. And it was a jolly good system. They realized that you were not only a menace to yourself, but a menace to the rest of the squadron if you went on too long.
Richthoven's aristocratic sense of duty allowed him no such escape.
I should indeed consider myself a despicable person if now, honored with glory and decorations, I became a pensioner of my own dignity in order to preserve my life for the nation, while every poor fellow in the trenches endures his duty. There is nothing left of the lively, merry war, as our deeds were called in the beginning. Now we must fight off despair. I am in wretched spirits after every aerial battle. I go to my quarters and do not want to see anyone or hear anything. I think of the war as it really is. It is very serious, very grim.
He was a very brave man. He went beyond the normal levels of endurance for anybody of his ilk. And he died because of it. He lacked caution, he was war-weary, his attention easily wandered. And at the end, he was caught cold.
It will never be known who brought Richthoven down. The credit most likely belongs to Australian machine gunners. When his plane crashed behind Allied lines, he was found dead in the cockpit, killed by a single bullet. The great trophy hunter became the hunted. The wreckage of his aircraft and even items of his clothing were torn to pieces for souvenirs. For British pilots, a shadow was lifted.
I remember being in the mess when the telephone went and the CO answered it, and this was the news that Richthofen had been shot down, and you'd be surprised at the noise that everybody cheered, which shows the effect that Richthofen had on the Royal Flying Corps.
As a mark of respect for a brave foe, Richthofen was given a burial with full military honours. 6 British officers acted as pallbearers. Over the grave, an Australian detachment fired a salute.
His image, though, continued to be built up. The Germans didn't drop him because he was dead. There was still a lot of potency in the vision of the heroic German. And this, in fact, carried on after the war through to the rise of the Nazis. And the Luftwaffe, under Hermann Göring, used his image totally to imbue them with the same sort of prowess and the same sort of chivalry, if you wish to use that phrase. His image didn't die. Today, we still know him as well as the people in 1918 did.